I want to welcome you to the 7th now lecture of the Peacemaking in Africa lecture series, the International Studies Institute Fall Lecture Series. I'm going to allow, as usual, someone else to do the introducing of our actual speaker, but I do want to make a couple announcements, basic thank yous to a bunch of organizations and departments at UNM. The main organization is, of course, the New Mexico Humanities Council, which has given us the bulk of our money for this lecture series. This is an organization in the state that puts on a lot of different events, not just this lecture series, not just lecture series, all sorts of things for all different ages, in all different parts of the state as well. I mean, they do things in like Silver City and so forth. So check them out, check out their website, or you can check out their office. It's kind of in Nob Hill on Silver, kind of near that big new storage unit. Makes Nob Hill that much more beautiful. So they're a great organization, so I definitely would encourage you to check them out. Some other people I want to thank, though, are people at the university. So certainly Dr. Stewart and Loyola Chastain, who both work for the International Studies Institute, and who have done the majority of the work, quite frankly. I get to stand up here and say these things, and I look all impressive and so forth, but really they are the two people who've done the majority of the work for this lecture series. But there's also some other departments I want to thank. So some departments that have given us some money, like Africana Studies, like Anthropology, Foreign Languages and Literatures, English, the Honors College, and History as well. These are all departments that have contributed to this because they felt this was an important lecture series, so I want to thank them as well. And then the last group I want to thank, I will thank while introducing our introducer, so to speak. So I want to introduce James Goodman, who is a student here. He's a senior here in political science and geography. He works on international borders, like establishing borders, border disputes, and so forth. He is also very active in encouraging and helping run high school and college level Model UN programs. And he is also the president of the World Affairs Delegation here at UNM. And that's the last group I want to thank, because they are also helping to support this lecture series. So James is going to be introducing our speaker, so I will turn it over to him.
Thank you, Dr. Bishop. It's my pleasure to be here this evening to introduce the next in this fall lecture series. And before I get into introducing Dr. Jamal Martin, I'd just like to thank Dr. Bishop, Dr. Stewart, and anyone else that I've worked with to set up and to host these lectures. This is a really great opportunity not only for our organization to be a part of this, but also to help bring these lectures to the UNM community. And it's been a really, really good experience.
Sorry.
And it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Jamal Martin to you this evening. He is a professor here at the university in Africana Studies, and I'm sure some or many of you have had him as a professor. Unfortunately, I haven't to date, but our next semester.
Exactly right.
There you go. Dr. Martin holds advanced degrees in community health development and education from the University of New Mexico and the University of Hawaii. And although his education is in the healthcare field, he has transitioned his academics into Africana studies, focusing on race, ethnicity, religious and historical African identities, and combines that with his research in healthcare policy and global health, and his research on international institutions, and incorporates all of that into his various curricula. And furthermore, he also does still teach in the healthcare field in the medical school, particularly in global health policy, health justice, and international health institutions, as well as other classes in epidemiology, and I could go on. But so his academic background, it's pretty clear that relates to the topic for this evening's lecture, which is healthcare and structural violence in post-colonial Africa. And this is an area of research and kind of a topic that I'm personally very interested in. And so without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jamal Martin.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for inviting me to this process to share a little bit about what I know about this subject matter and to try to open up my mind so that I can learn further from this. So I only have 30 minutes, and so and that's not enough time for me. An hour is not enough time for me. 2 hours is not enough time for me. But so if I feel rushed through this, please bear with me. We've already covered some of this with the students before, and now I've got to figure out how to cherry pick certain slides to go through this in the next half hour or so. So if you hear me say advance, 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 it's because it's not that it's important, but I'm trying to get through some essential things so that you'll get the gist about where we're going with this and ask further questions about this. So I'm going to shut up for a moment now and ask my esteemed colleague Sarah to go ahead and start advance to the next slide. Okay. When I was first asked to do this talk, this was the title that was proposed to me: Health Systems and Structural Violence in Post-Colonial Africa. And one of the things that we like to say is we like to talk about systems rather than care, in terms of understanding structures and institutions. And so I have to ask the question, why African health awareness? And I put this slide together and I thought that you should understand why this awareness exists. And in the center of this pyramid, you'll see that it says Global Awareness, UNM General Education Requirements. And over the last 2 years or so, I've been serving as a General Education Fellow out of the Academic Provost Office to create more global awareness and have that placed into the general education requirements at this university. And that was something I was grateful to do because I'm a globalist in that sense. And I also work with the race and social justice thing, but this one was more fun. So as we talk about why African health awareness, I want to think about not only this mandate from the university, but the fact that we have to think about ethical engagement, the issues that this global awareness and this notion about dealing with human suffering is grounded in social historical awareness, the social construction of reality, and social suffering of people. And I said before in the other class, once we lose our intellectual empathy for social justice, we become sociopaths. So this is a clear opportunity to think about what suffering means on a global scale, on a national scale, and international scale, and why we do the things that we do. And this is about inspiration, about the possibilities and probabilities. So next, please. So very quickly, the background with this, as I said before, with the work that we do, you can't do this through a historical lens. So in order to understand health systems in Africa, we have to understand and deconstruct the whole history of the problems associated with and exacerbated by the globalization of 500 years of slavery, scientific racism, colonialism, and imperialism. As you can see, the papal division of the globe, the transatlantic chattel slave issues. Next, please. Crimes against humanity. I put this in because lately I've been using the film King Leopold's Ghost, and I've also shown films on the Berlin Conference. And this notion, crimes against humanity, was something that was coined by an African-American journalist and scholar by the name of George Washington Williams, who had visited the Congo during the time when Leopold was doing all his work. And when he observed what was going on, he coined the phrase crimes against humanity. And I think it's an important thing for us to understand right now as we talk about the social issues and issues of human rights and violations of human rights, because they are crimes against humanity when we go through this level. So from the Berlin Conference to Cape Town to Cairo, The White Man's Burden by Kipling. And I mentioned several books that people should read about this also too. Hochberg's book, King Leopold's Ghost, Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and Thomas Packingham's the Scramble for Africa, where he talked about the 3 C's: commerce, colonialism, and civilization. Next slide, please. People tend to think about terra incognito. This is what people think about when they usually think about Africa. This is a map, obviously, of the colonized states and territories. Next, please. I think it's important as we think about this, as we talk about colonized spaces, is to understand the characteristics of, and the logic and ideology and praxis of neoliberalism and settler colonialism, the racialization, the exceptionalism, the expansionism, the denial, the elimination, and the securitization. And this notion of securitization right now sort of fits in with an article that I asked you folks to read about human security and what that really means, because I think it should be, health and human security. Next slide, please. Emerging issues as we move out of the Cold War from the East-West balance to the North-South divide. These issues of understanding the post-colonial expressions and something Martin Luther King coined, the triplets of evil: racism, materialism, and extreme militarism, which have had an impact on this history of the world. Thank you. So the independent nation states and the new scramble for Africa in terms of the resources of the world to fuel materialism and militarism and the other triplets and the others coin of that side of that coin. Next, please. As Bill Richardson said some years ago, Africa matters. So I put this here so people get an understanding of the dimensions of Africa in terms of its immensity and its diversity in terms of land, flora, fauna, culture, nation, everything, because we're all one human family. And so as we think about the health of Africa, we have to think about the total Earth ecosystem, the health of cities, the socioeconomic components, the health of diverse populations, And as we think about this, something else that Martin Luther King said, do we want chaos or do we want community? Next slide, please. So this is about the Anthropocene, and we talk about the issues of human security in terms of human vulnerabilities, conflict sensitivity, societal stability, climate sensitivity, and I'm sorry that my back is turned to you folks. I'm sorry. And issues of natural resources in terms of environmental vulnerabilities. So when we think about the last 500 years of human history and the impact that it's had on our planet, we have to think about who are the most vulnerable under a supremacist ideology. And we'll answer that question in a moment or so, but we have to think about how that ideology, that supremacist ideology, has led to many of these problems also too. So next slide, please. So we have to think about analysis of power and leadership, the types of power, power over, power with others, power from within, the gender setting. Yes, please. I'm on a roll here now.
Wait, I already went to. Did I?
No, that's no. Go back for this. Go next one. Okay. Nope. It was a graph that said.
One more?
Oh, maybe you did go too far. Okay. Just briefly, the United States really didn't start giving more foreign policy attention until the Nixon administration, in terms of its influence on Africa and what they were doing. But prior to that time, it was considered, a tar baby. Don't get involved in anything in Africa because you stick to it and you never get free from it, okay? So let's get to something, the heart of this matter, in terms of understanding structural violence, something I picked up from John Galton in his work that he brought from Martin Luther King, and it became part of my dissertation work also too, in terms of understanding the impact of trauma on the brains of children and what that means for learning and development and their development. So you have this, think about this pyramid as an iceberg, and when we talk about, violence, most people only see the tip of that iceberg, which is considered direct violence, okay? And we'll break that down in a moment or so. But below that borderline is invisible violence, the structural and cultural violence. And so let's define the structural violence a little bit more. So this formula that I put together for structural violence is basically supremacist ideology as being the root cause of this. Basically, some people feel that they're superior to others, and if they feel superior to others, that means they can dominate them, control them, subjugate them, and continue to dehumanize them, and take away their human dignity. And so this supremacist ideology has turned into discriminatory acts, cultural and historical trauma, disparities and inequities, and it's led to structural dominance in terms of power and privilege, racialization, materialism and militarism, and that structural dominance forms oppression. And oppression, I'm defining it as ageism, sexism, genderism, ableism, language issues, and somehow we find ourselves compartmentalized to only take on one piece of those fractions when we should be addressing the whole phenomena of oppression in many ways. But oppression leads to several types of injustices. And the first type of injustice is distributive injustice, how a resource is allocated, and by the same simple political definition from the 1930s, who gets what, how, when, where, and why, okay? Procedural injustice, what are those rules that make up that distribution, and how this fits into economics and all kinds of things, as you see. Procedural injustice, retributive injustice, punishment. We have a system that does not really believe in restorative justice and healing. Everything is about punishment. And then you have moral exclusion, cultural imperialism. So these form the basis of a system that becomes structural violence. Next, please. So when we look at the rough landscapes of structural violence, we see that there's a mantra that people have a choice, but we don't often see that people are constrained by their choices, depending on what type of education they have and their living circumstances. So it's not so much about the confines of place, but the biggest problem is the severe limits imposed on human thought and action. This says, let's move away from violence, let's move towards peace and justice, and that engenders and intensifies inequalities that affect children, families, communities, and regions. And so these notions of disparities and inequalities and inequities and structural violence reflect the pervasive power of place, and there's a need for a critical analysis of power as we go through this. Next slide. So, structural violence. As we talk about structural violence, we have to talk about social structures, economic, political, legal, religious, and structural, the culture that stop individuals and groups from reaching their full potential. It's embedded deeply in our educational system, in our society, and all the programs, in the economic organization of the world. Why is it violent? Because it causes physical and psychological harm to the individuals resulting from that exploitation and those unjust social, political, and economic systems. And it causes injury to people, typically not those, who created it in the first place, although there may be a stain in their soul. But as I said before, we'll have to get into some metaphysical things about that a little bit later. But I want to say this, as we talk about structural violence, when you look at the slide here, you'll see that it's about disparities, disabilities, and deaths that result from systems, institutions, policies, or cultural beliefs that meet some people's needs, but not others. And their human rights at the expense of others. Structural violence creates relationships that cause secondary violence to occur. Secondary violence is what we see above that baseline in the pyramid, that direct stuff, okay? So that secondary violence is alcohol abuse, drug abuse, suicide, depression, internalized oppression, community destruction, crime, interpersonal violence, domestic violence, rape, national and international destruction, rebel movements, terrorism, suicide, civil wars, revolutions, coups, and wars. And so the reactions and responses to destructive violence are secondary violence. You know, at some point, we need to really start looking at the root causes of much of this. Next slide, please. So we have to start thinking about, you know, about policies that exist or don't exist that yield inadequate food, housing, water, shelter, safe and working conditions, education, economic security. People live a life of oppression, exclusion, exploitation, marginalization, collective humiliation, stigmatization, the loss of human dignity, the dehumanization. And it's not their fault. But in some places, because of the stressors that build up from this violence, this secondary violence and direct violence, people arm themselves to protect their commodities and access to them. So they overlook the connections between consumerism and oppressive regimes. And again, the most marginalized groups suffer the most: women, children, elders, those from different ethnic, racial, cultural, religious groups, and sexual orientation. Next, please. So, alert signs. I didn't want to share a whole lot of data with you folks. I'm an epidemiologist, and we're broken down by age and sex. Ba-doom. So we disaggregate the data by age and sex. Da-doom. But I don't want to bore you with a whole lot of statistics. But I will say that when you look at the statistics, when you see these alert signs, poverty line indicators, disease outbreaks, basic needs index, unemployment, youth without jobs, food shortages, famine, violence, oppression, political instability, corruption, disintegration of government institutions, and migration, it's happening. It's real. And it's real to the people who are experiencing it. And there's a loss of their human dignity during those processes. Thank you. Equity, social justice, you know, community participation, health promotion, and appropriate use of resources and intersectional actions are really what's necessary with this. And this is something I learned after I finished my master's in public health, and I worked with UNICEF and WHO. And I learned that you can't have a healthy economy unless you have healthy people. And it's more than pills and medicines. You have to look at these other structures and things of that nature. And so having gone from clinical stuff to public health, my mantra really is prevention is better than cure. Next slide, please. So one of my favorite slides here. And so for the wretched of the earth, medicine alone cannot deal with the many factors that cause ill health. So you have an impoverished person here who's been affected or disaffected by the toxic smoke from poverty and injustice and caste systems and lack of facilities and myths and exploitation. And he's breathing that in, so he goes to see a physician. And the best thing the physician can say is that all I can give you is syrup for your cough, because they're not trained to understand and deal with these particular issues and things of this nature. There's another slide that I have with this that I couldn't find in my packets that shows two impoverished persons talking about their poverty and how poverty has had an impact on their health and how their bad health has had an impact on their well-being and led to poverty. So next slide, please. So again, one of the big things I worked on overseas initially in my career was responses to the World Health Organization's Alma Ata Declaration that basically re-invoked the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, Articles 25 and 26. Health is a human right and education is a human right. And basically they outlined 8 points that says the basis of a primary care system. This is universal care, not insurance, folks. This is what universal care looks like. It's supposed to look like. Education concerning prevailing health problems and the methods for prevention and control. Promotion of food supply and proper nutrition. Adequate supply of safe water and basic sanitation. Maternal and child health care, including family planning. Immunizations against major infectious diseases. Prevention and control of locally endemic diseases. Appropriate treatment of common diseases and injuries. And provision of essential drugs. And when this came out in '78, they said, we're going to accomplish this by the year 2000. No way. And why didn't it work? You know, sovereignty. Countries basically said, don't interfere with our sovereignty. We don't have to do this if we don't want to. You know, and they got in the way of a lot of this also too. Then you have to look at the political economy of many different nations who decided this issue of, like, you know, basic economics. You all had economics 101, guns versus butter. Do you want to feed your people? Do you want weapons? You know, so a lot of these arguments came into place and sort of stifled this, but progress has been made. And several years ago, I worked on primary care renewal issues in the Caribbean and South America. Next slide, please. Yeah, okay. People really don't know what public health is. And people don't think about public health until there's a national emergency or a humanitarian disaster, and then people say, like, oh, our public health infrastructure is in jeopardy, we need to do something about it. But public health usually isn't supported because it's not sexy. There's no drama involved. You don't see medical shows on TV about public health. It's always somebody in the emergency room and other things that are going on in the doctor's office, all that stuff. But it's one of the efforts created and organized by society to protect, promote, and restore the people's health. And it's a combination of skills and sciences to improve and maintain the health of the people. I mentioned earlier today, I mentioned Cicero's statement about Salus Publicus Suprema Lex Esto. The health of the people is the supreme law of the land. Okay? So we have to think about these issues from this perspective, and this is the lens that I'm going to be looking at the rest of this through. Next, please. So the fundamental human rights-based approaches to health. In terms of health promotion and disease prevention, you see here on the far side these bulleted points of conditions and resources for health. What's the first thing you see listed on this? Peace. It's not shelter, education, food, income, stable ecosystems, sustainable resources, social justice, equity. It's about peace. You know, so in the last session, we asked people to kind of define what we thought peace was and what it wasn't, and why it's absent and things of that nature. But and I thought about this more after I became director temporary for 3 years under the Peace and Justice Study program. And when I went back to my old records and stuff and saw peace listed at the top of this, I thought, like, okay, I'm on the right track here as I talk about violence as a public health issue and how do we support peace building, okay? And how we continue to ask people to promote health by advocating and enabling and mediating for things, because improvement in health requires a secure foundation in these basic precepts. If we don't have peace, then everything else is chaos, okay? Next slide, please. I'm going to skip over, well, let me just say this. The impact of emerging infectious diseases. These are the factors that result in emerging infectious diseases. And bottom line with this is that these things don't happen out of context in many ways. Go back and watch the film Contagion if you want to see what I'm talking about. And you'll see this from the beginning to the end. You realize, like, oh, when we destroy the environment, you know, through technology and industry or improper land use and economic development, more opportunities for international travel and commerce, microbial adaptation. And that's a big one. People tend to think, I have a colleague here who's been working with me on antimicrobial resistance for a number of years. And these buggers are live things, you know, they don't just disappear just because you give them an antibiotic. They evolve and they grow. So they adapt. And so when you think about this last Ebola outbreak that had taken place, you know, the thing that was really unique about that took place was that primarily Ebola was seen in the Congo and other places where there's tremendous conflict and disease and death and fighting and war going on, but it moved to West Africa in some ways also too. And that shows you how these things become borderless and they spread because of the breakdowns in public health measures. When there's lack of food, housing, shelter, peace, you know, other types of things, sugar, honey, iced tea happens. Take the first letter from that. Next slide, please. Just in terms of neglected tropical disease about Africa, I just want to say to reduce the burden of those things, you have to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, promote gender equality and empower women, reduce childhood mortality, combat HIV, malaria, and other diseases, achieve universal primary education, and improve maternal health. The achieving universal primary education is a big one in Africa and other places because many people don't have the resources to go beyond 6th grade or 8th grade in many ways also too. And education is the most robust predictor of health and well-being. But in this country, we tend to think of education, get an education because it would produce wealth. But it is about the human beings, and it is about your nature, because the more education you have, the better decisions you can make about your circumstances, provided you're not getting colonized in your education process, which is another story. But these are neglected tropical diseases, and they can be reduced also too. And this was the basis of public health initiative when the colonizers and settlers started moving to Africa and Asia, because they were dying from these diseases, and they decided we got to figure out some way to try to solve these situations. But like in many ways, they didn't understand why people weren't living in those areas because they knew of the diseases. It was like even Jamestown, Virginia, when the settlers settled there, you know, they didn't realize the Native Americans weren't living there because they said, like, it's too swampy, it's too foggy, it's too many bugs, too many mosquitoes. We're not going to live there. It's just, you know. Or the issues of trying to build the Panama Canal, you know, and the deaths that resulted from yellow fever. And then realized, oh, it's a mosquito that's causing this. So we get rid of Washington, D.C., and swamplands and foggy bottom. You know, malaria and yellow fever were rampant all the time until they decided to drain the swamps. So there's the lesson there, you know, first drain the swamps to get rid of the alligators. Next. So this just kind of tells you issues regarding public health, international health, and global health, its geographic reach, its levels of cooperation, individuals and populations, access to health, a range of disciplines. And as I told the group earlier, I'm now evolving where I've gone from public health and international health and global health, and I'm thinking now that I have to start thinking about planetary health. You know, what does this mean for the entire planet? Next slide. And what would that look like? So, social epidemiology and the geographic study of life and death. We're going through this third revolution in public health, from infectious diseases to chronic diseases. And as we talk about the social determinants of health, we understand now where you live, work, play, and go to school has a big impact on your health. One of the things that I tell the students and others is that this is more important than genetic code. Zip code is more important than genetic code. Where you live, work, play, and go to school has a bigger impact on your health and well-being. And so this is not about biological determinism in terms of your age, sex, and heredity factors or individual lifestyle factors, but the social community networks in terms of agriculture and food production, education, the work environment, living and working conditions, unemployment, water, sanitation, healthcare services, housing, the general socioeconomic, cultural, and environmental conditions. This is what we have to actually work on and improve. And I think I'm just about running out of time here, so you can skip. Okay, I want to say this one. As we talk about statistics, two of the biggest statistics that we look at to understand a nation's well-being are infant mortality rate and life expectancy. I'm not going to get into infant mortality rate in this discussion, but if we go to the next slide, I want to talk about life expectancy. If we had a Health Olympics in 2014 based upon the United Nations developmental data that was published in 2015, you'll see that out of 187 nations where they're rated, the United States is here, 35, 79.1 years of age, okay? Most of the accomplishments that have happened, the things that have given Americans a longer lifespan over the last 100 years has been public health measures, not medical science. It's been public health measures that's increased our lifespan. But when you look at what's happening, all these things that I have in yellow are countries in Africa right now. And when you look at this lifespan for men and women, and you go like, okay, Swaziland, 49 years of age. I mean, if somebody's dying at the age of 49, and that's the average in those countries, how can they be a productive, growing nation? You know, even if we want to get into economics or capitalism or mixed economies and anything else, how can they be productive if they're dying off? You know, and to tell you the truth, if we take the infant mortality rates of those countries and compare it, you see like, this is a serious condition here in many ways. So we have to start thinking about this from a public health lens. Okay, no, leave it there. Leave it there, we go back to that. So I want to say this issue about stress. The chronic stress that builds up from living under those oppressive conditions has a really deleterious impact on our bodies. So as we talk about these stressors, and again, the joke is, but it's a reality, the only person that doesn't have stress is a dead person. Stress is normally a good thing for you. It helps you to motivate you to do the things that you need to do. But if you're caught up in a situation where your foot is constantly on that gas pedal and you're flooring it, you have more and more cortisol and epinephrine flowing through your body to deal with those stresses, and you either fight or run away or you freeze and do nothing. But the problem is, you get locked into that neurochemical imbalance, and you can't get to this part of the brain where logic, language, and problem solving takes place. So you're always looking for the source of the trauma, because the brain's primary directive is survival. And the brain will do whatever is necessary in order to survive. So as we talk about the stresses, uncertainty, and fear and anxiety, which I was saying earlier today too, that I'm looking at a lot of data regarding the pandemic of neuroses that exists right now, because there's a lot of fear and anxiety all around the world on many issues because of what's going on. And you're seeing it with students and everybody. Everybody's worrying about things. It's not depression yet, but there's a great deal of concern and worry because people are not certain how they're going to deal with that stress. But usually, you know, there's an appraisal, then an exposure to those personal factors. And if you've got the right tools at hand, then you have less stress or no stress, which eustress, good stress. Distress and the stress response leads to coping and intrusive thoughts. It leads to behaviors such as smoking, alcohol abuse, improper diet, substance abuse, physical inactivity, lack of adherence and compliance to medical treatments, the physiological effects in terms that it could lead to immunocompetence, immunosuppression, or immunodeficiencies, and on the far side of this, suicide, homicide, and genocide. You know. So next slide, please. So you know, people carry their histories in their bodies. They embody their history in their bodies. And so it can be direct effects or indirect effects. The indirect effects are material interpretations, the psychosocial interpretations about the living conditions of relative socioeconomic disadvantage, or the graded relationship between your socioeconomic position on the ladder and access to tangible goods and services of society. But it can be latent. Early life environment affects adult health independent of intervening experience. This is why children and health is so important to me, and why we save the children. You know, because if we allow them to stay under those circumstances, you know, as Frederick Douglass said, it's easier to fix broken children than it is broken adults. You know, but the thing about this latent experience carries on into later life, so it becomes a pathway. Early life environment sets individuals into life trajectories that affect health status over time, and it can be cumulative in terms of the intensity and duration of that exposure to those stressful events. Again, the thing that worries me the most about this, when I look at the data, the neuroscience data on children and under these distressors, is that it affects the hippocampus of the brain. And when the hippocampus of the brain is affected that way, there's a loss of memory and learning. And for others who have power and they misuse that power, because of their fear network, what happens is that they basically lose their empathy and they become sociopaths. Also, when you don't care about the suffering of other people, you become a sociopath. So, next slide, so we're going to breathe through some things. Body cell stories and cannot be studied, divorced from the conditions of existence. Body cell stories that people cannot or will not tell, either because they are unable, forbidden, or choose not to tell. Next, please. So this is just, you know, this is what I'm talking about here, the third revolution of public health right now, where we're going from infectious diseases. We're still dealing with them, And we're still dealing with disease of lifestyle in terms of diabetes, heart disease. In fact, we're finding the stresses are the ones that's causing that also too. The heart disease and the cancer and other types of things. That's the precursor of that. Then the social determinants of health. And these are the 10 core functions of public health and the 10 essential services that I've worked in that I try to bring to solving these problems, internationally, nationally. Skip that. I want to say this about health promotion and disease prevention as we think about peace and violence and things of this nature. Why we need to think about primary prevention and secondary prevention as well. Primary prevention is really about dealing with people who may be susceptible to a particular illness or contagion or viral or something. So you want to reduce the disease and the incidence of new cases. Secondary prevention is dealing with people who are asymptomatic. They've always had a tremendous amount of exposure and maybe showing a few signs but not full-blown disease as of yet. And so we want to reduce the prevalence, those background cases and the consequences of those. Tertiary prevention of care is symptomatics. People got all kinds of wacky, crazy systems, it's endemics. They got multiple medical problems and issues and stuff. And what we try to do here is reduce the complications and disability. Our healthcare budget in this country is $2 to $4 trillion a year, and 95% of our money goes here. You know, when we know that everything is 100% preventable. So, the tagline that I bought from a nurse many years ago is that we suffer from prevention deficit disorder. Next slide, please. So let's skip this. Let me just say this. Health and all policies. Next one, please. Okay. This is something that was started in the late 70s with the United Nations, WHO also too. And we're starting to appreciate this here in New Mexico and other places too. Health is just not pills and medicines. Health is transportation, it's labor, it's agriculture, it's housing, it's all those things. And as I said before, many times I tell the students, we can't treat people with pills and medicines and put them back into socially toxic environments. It's just going to get worse and they'll be back in the hospital with exacerbations and multiple medical problems again. But too much money is made off the suffering of ill people also too. A lot of altruism is gone from this system. But what are the roles and responsibilities of government? And intergovernmental organizations and structures, the concepts and principles. I mean, the preamble of the Constitution says it is the government's responsibility to provide for the general welfare of the people. That means put things in place, fix structures so that people get their basic needs met. Prevention spectrum, strengthening individual knowledge and skills, promoting community education, educating providers, fostering coalitions and networks, changing organizational practices, influencing policy and legislation. Please move on for just a moment. This is another important stream that we've been using to talk about downstream and upstream interventions. A lot of our money and effort goes in this little block right here, clinical care, dealing with individuals. And not saying we shouldn't do it, okay? But you can see through this arrow here, when we talk about communities and society institutions by operationalizing health promotion and prevention, public advocacy, and intersectoral working issues in terms of jobs, housing, education, health increases exponentially, and that's where we need to go. So this is working upstream, this is working downstream. One of the things, the anecdotes that I've used is that you and a colleague are strolling down, near the Rio Grande on a nice autumn day. And all of a sudden, you're enjoying the sounds and the sights and smells and all this, you're having a good time. It's a nice autumn day. And you hear somebody, shouting for help. So you run to the riverbank and you see somebody floating down the river screaming for help. So you jump in and pull that person out and get back to shore. When you get back to shore, you try to collect your breath and then you realize, okay, somebody else is floating down the river screaming for help. So you jump back in and try to rescue that person. Meanwhile, you've exhausted some of your resources and you're more tired. But you've done a good job, you've done a good thing, you come back to shore, then you see 3 or 4 or 5 other people floating down the river, and you realize, I can't jump in and save each one of them every single time. The idea is to go upstream. What's happening? Is somebody throwing people into the Rio Grande? Was it an accident? What's causing it in the first place? And that's what we mean by working upstream. What are the policies that exist, or the policies that should exist to ensure the dignity and well-being of individuals? Okay, so social justice recommendations. This semester I'm teaching Africana philosophy and research methods. And so, and one of the things I've always enjoyed about public health that it's rooted in social justice. But one of the things I've noticed also too, that the social justice phenomenon that we're looking at, particularly by Rawls, doesn't really include, racism and racialization and other things. It's very generic. And so, as we talk about Eurocentric education, Afrocentric education, this is the perspective that I'm coming from now. So next slide, really, please. This is a slide that I put on the poster that I found, and I thought, I like this picture, this painting done, because it's called A Ray of Hope. And I thought, oh, this is nice. And when you see this ray of hope, you see the plant life, you see the sunlight, you see the fishes swimming, unharmed, the cattle, the houses, just like, there's balance, there's harmony, there's justice, there's fairness. you know, and I think that's the hope that we're looking for in many ways that we're trying to achieve. Also, the thing about the baobab trees, the first time I was in Africa, it was like, not this particular tree, I was like, oh wow, baobab trees, acacia trees, oh shoot, this is cool. And the baobab fruit was good, but they're resilient. And they store water in those trunks also too. And the fruit is delicious, full of vitamin C and all kinds of other things. So I thought it's a great kind of a metaphor for survivorship and resiliency in harsh environments also too. I wanted to say this because as we talk about African history and work, people think that Africa had no history based upon Hegel's work and some of the Eurocentric theorists and philosophers and what have you. Africa had no history to begin with, and therefore it was easy when you say people have no history and they're less than human, it's easy to denigrate them and dehumanize them. But you see on this chart here, you see some of Africa's great kingdoms and empires, and then going back to ancient Kemet, I'm seeing the intersections of cosmology, ontology, epistemology, axiology, religion, and science. And these principles are in education that dealt with this notion of ma'at, which is justice, as opposed to isfet, which is chaos. So let's define those terms a little bit more. And a lot of this was about peace and hope. So when you think about Nile Valley civilization and the project, the civil engineering projects, that was not slave labor. Those were civil engineering projects that was done by healthy people, healthy mind and body and soul, to do X, Y, and Z, and to establish a society where religion and science and mathematics and everything flourish. Students who've had my class before know that one of my favorite words is metacognition, thinking about thinking while thinking to improve your thinking, because the problems you have to solve are so complex, it can't be done with one tool alone. You need multiple levels of analysis, multiple tools. But this quantum model that I have here represents the human brain, the source of all human experience. And so as we perceive and deal with our world, we have to look at space and energy and life unknown, time and matter. And this fits into the metaphysical issues of ancient Egypt and the schools of knowledge in terms of cosmology, aesthetics, epistemology, and axiology. And all that was about this natural quest for ma'at, which is defined in the hieroglyphics as a deep wisdom, truth, justice, order, righteousness, balance, harmony, and reciprocity. So once you've learned ma'at, it's a sacred responsibility to teach those things, to help a society to grow. The opposite of that is isfet, chaos. And chaos does not support justice, it doesn't support life, it doesn't support stability, it doesn't support health, and it definitely doesn't support peace. And this is part of the name of a famous African multi-talented genius, Imhotep, who Hollywood turned into a maniacal monster. He was a physician and everything. In fact, his name Imhotep means basically one who is at peace comes in peace. So with this learning, as we take people back to their African roots and things of their nature, I think it's important for Africa, because some of this spread in other languages and things across the continent. And if you want to look more into that, look at the work of Sheikh Anta Diop. Okay, next slide, we're almost finished here. We have to care for those left out. We have to make human development resilient. We have to empower those left out, pursue measures for groups with special needs, reaching out for those using universal policies. This is where the caring comes in, and you move beyond the suffering. Last but not least, human development focuses on the richness of human lives rather than the richness of economies. So it's about functioning, capabilities, and agency. And agency is a big part of that African education thing. Next slide, please. Human security. I gave you folks a reading on human security because I think we should be calling it human and health security, or health and human security. And it's not just about protection of the borders in that sense, it's about the protection of the people. It's not about things on that level. But it focuses on basic needs, capabilities, approach, and threats. So, human security places emphasis on considering a wide range of linkages between non-traditional threats to security, both in analysis and in the development policy initiatives. And when I think about that, I think about the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainability Development Goals. Okay. Next, please. Concepts and discourse on securing humanity. You guys can read that. Let's skip and move on right now. So why peace? Violence is a serious public health problem. Violence can be direct, it's structural, it can be cultural. And peace is not merely the absence of violence, but mutually beneficial, cooperative working relationships.
Starting.
That's okay. We're just about near the end of that anyway, so.
Is it just have an update or something?
No, we're just about to end of that. So I'm going to stop there because I want to give you folks the time for Q&A because we only had a half hour and I've probably taken about 25 minutes of that already. But I do have a couple of questions that I want to ask you folks also too. And this is something I do in my classes. So I've bombarded you with a lot of stuff. I've thrown everything at you but the kitchen sink, but that's how I roll. Hoping that something will stick, What did you hear today or learn today that's new to you that you didn't know before? What new fact or what piece of information, that's new to you that you didn't know before?
Is there
say I learned about metacognition is the thinking of thinking for the use of thinking.
Okay.
And we use
Okay.
that in order to support the ideology of MAD, which is peace.
Right on. Right on. Another new fact, thank you. Another piece of information that you take away from a new fact. Don't be shy.
So I'm actually a major in population health, so a lot of this information is kind of a review, but I think the emphasis on peace as a part of health is something that we haven't really stressed a lot in
I
our
know.
classes, so I thought that was really interesting.
I'm trying to build a program in health diplomacy. Yes.
I got some ideas about why the healthcare in America is failing people. So I don't have experience going to countries in Africa, so I don't really know the details of how each system is failing each set of citizens, but I was able to understand somewhat of the American situation here.
Okay. Well, a famous reporter in America by the name of Walter Cronkite once said many years ago that the American healthcare system is neither system nor healthy. And having worked in the system for a number of years, you know, and through research, I can tell you that 1/3 of what's done in medicine is of no value, 1/3 is of little value, and the remaining third is dangerous. When you think about iatrogenesis, and social iatrogenesis, and stuff that's not reported in the statistics, you know, it's like shocking. And I don't want to shock you folks with that one today, but one other new fact, a piece of information. Okay, emotionally, what was going through your minds when you heard this stuff? What were your feelings?
I was very upset because you mentioned how where you live,
Play and live and go to
where you
school.
play, that is what determines your health.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's why I tell the medical students, we can't treat people with pills and medicines and put them back in a socially toxic environments. It doesn't work, you know. Another emotional piece, yes.
I work as a scribe in the case community, and a lot of what we see is a lot of repeat patients who know what kind of situations they're in. And you're absolutely right. You can't just give them some ibuprofen and send them home. You know they're going to be back next week for whatever. They can't afford those bills. You're so right. The environment is such a huge impact on your health.
So how do you feel about that?
It's upsetting.
It's upsetting. And this is not my purpose to upset you folks. Don't get me wrong. But if you're upset, I hope you form some notion of righteous indignation that you want to solve it.
It's upsetting in the way that you don't want to just sit there and say, oh well, there's nothing I can do.
Oh, yeah.
It's upsetting in that you want to change.
And it's easy to become mechanical like that in this system. That's why I got out of healthcare after a while, because I thought like, okay, I'm losing my humanity here. I'm not seeing the suffering on this level anymore, and that was disturbing to me. And I thought like, okay, I need to do something different. Yes, another emotional piece, yes.
I think one of the things that stood out to me the most is the fact that us as US, all of our resources and allocation towards healthcare, all of that money, all of those resources that are put into the wrong place, that isn't improving the state of the state of health of everyone in general is also upsetting. And I like that we kind of had a discussion about it, because I think the first step to making those changes is having that awareness about it. And I think that emotional responses to these things are very important, and that's what drives us to make those changes. And so I'm glad that we had a conversation.
Well, one of the things I learned from working in peace studies was that I coined this phrase, transformative optimism, hope. We can't lose that. Another emotional piece.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. You and I have worked together for a really long time, and the thing that I always glean from these kinds of talks and presentations is that it is a really hard thing to conceptualize and talk about, but in the end I have hope, because social justice praxis is everything, and when we approach health and interdisciplinary health and social issues, we can really make a lot of strides when we, open up our minds and, do things from a social justice oriented lens, especially when it comes to health.
That's true. One of the last slides that I had, and it was a little sign that says, I do this for the coming generations after me, because I'm standing on the shoulders of so many people, and I have to give it back.
To me, I just want to share my opinion that it's not really surprising to see this. As you mentioned that in America, if you got more education, that means more wealth. That's the opinion that people have all the time.
I know.
And I'm not surprised by that, because I'm in the pre-dental career going into my studying. And a lot of people, I'm surprised that they can say something like, oh, I'm doing it for the money, and it's easier to get into that career.
Oh, yeah.
And like the price is, the pay is phenomenal. But for me, like, people need to have some common sense of helping people, but not like, not
Yeah, we're losing
not just
altruism.
doing it for the money.
Anyways.
And I think that makes a really great connection when you're connecting the welfare and the health with the poverty and also the education, because I feel like people should focus more on people well-being for.
Yeah, we tend to care more about things than people.
Right.
Okay. So we've looked at unpacked some of our cognition. We've looked at some of our affective states. So what is the meaning of all this now? Now that you got your thinking and your feeling aligned, what does this mean? What does it mean to you? How do you interpret this?
Change has to be made somewhere.
Okay.
Upstream, hopefully.
Okay. Good.
We have to do something now.
Anybody agree with this, young man? Anything you want to add to that?
I agree with him.
Okay. Any other notions about what this all means? Yes, sir.
Well, I had the thought in terms of reflecting on all of this and the history of colonialism, the negative. It seems to me that the United Nations was one of the only major attempts to remedy some of the effects of colonialism, and yet the politics of the last 50 years have been stressing the United Nations and not supporting its mission. As it seems to me we're moving in the wrong direction, and I don't see a substitute for the United Nations right now.
Can I offer you a suggestion on that?
Yes, sir.
One of the things I've seen, because I've worked with the United Nations quite a bit, and I used to dream as a kid about working with UNICEF and being in Geneva, Switzerland and all that, but be that as it may, the issue is the Security Council, the Big Five. That's what we have to, smack their hands every now and then. But the hope that I see for many of the changes that are taking place, when you look at all the different international covenants and treaties and things of this nature, the General Assembly, the body of nations worldwide, they're making some fantastic things. If you go to the sources and look at the United Nations webpage and look at the reports and things, you go like, some marvelous stuff is happening here. But the issue is like, okay, how do we get people to unpack sovereignty and move to the next steps? So look at the work of Hugo Grotius and his whole work in international law and the sea and law of the maritime seas and stuff, and realize that was basically came about to broker peace between Protestant and Catholic nations for the wealth that was taken out of the New World and protection of properties and things. So it's an interesting thing to kind of look at international law from that perspective also too. But the General Assembly is doing some good work. Right. But you're right, the Security Council is putting undue force on people in many ways. Yes?
Just an extension of kind of what I think your idea is in breaking down the Security Council is breaking down like just borders and sovereignty in general and looking at these issues globally, like not just as a state issue, but globalizing these issues.
Now to do that, what we have to do as American citizens? We have to be more cognizant about what democracy means and because we have lots of people in office who do not respect human rights and human dignity, although there's arguments about whether human dignity is a right or not in that level. But remember, Congress, the Senate ratifies treaties. And if we keep electing people who don't want to ratify, some of these international covenants and things we have not approved of for over 30 years or so, just like, really? You mean Somalia, which has been in war for 30, 40 years, they ratified a treaty for the protection of children, and we can't even do that in this country? What's wrong with us in that sense? So it's these are some sovereign other types of things that we need greater, as I say from peace studies, we need more discourse, not debate, because debate leads to more conflict and frustration and aggravation and not problem solving. There's a lot to be done, but this is the first part of the discourse. So I guess my last question to you folks, and I know it's getting late and all kinds of other things, is sort of like we've gone through cognition, we've gone through affective states, we've done some interpretation. What are your next steps? What are our next steps as a human species?
When we spoke about kind of social determinants of health and about considerations of place and of space, that immediately set off a bell in my mind that relates pretty closely to environmental justice and environmental racism.
Yes, it does.
So how do you see those fields interacting?
I think they are fields. In fact, I'm thinking about taking a job in environmental racism somewhere else right now. You better start treating me better. So, no, but I think there's a play for it. I mean, when I showed you the chart before about the Anthropocene, when you look at all that, you know, and to make that really work, we've got to go back into the traditions of indigenous people all over the globe and pull that information out and say, hey, folks, we learned what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, what's inappropriate, and how do we recapture that and put that into our curriculums and other things also too, and how do we do that? So, but if it happens, it's going to be with you young folks. You're the next generation, and you students have a lot more power than you think you do. If you folks start standing up and advocating for things, people have to listen and do things. It's hard work, no doubt, but again, the battle is not just within this institution. It's what happens when you leave here, because many people have been trained in educational settings such as this one or others, wind up mimicking and maintaining the status quo. They don't think outside of that box because it's, you know, suicide. And even from faculty, you know, it's like, you know, like I've often said, like, I'm not going to get academic schizophrenia. You know, I'd like to have tenure, but I won't get it. But I have academic freedom, and that's more important to me than anything else. And then again, I'm still I call an academic sharecropper.
I'll stand up. My name is Bonnie. You mentioned the gentleman said the history of colonization about the negative ones, how they affected Africa. And you mentioned that the solution lies in G5, which they will solve the problems of Africa. But if my knowledge is correct, there is no African country that sits on G5, as you mentioned, which actually
I'm trying to remember when I said G5, I'm trying to remember the concept now.
Security Council.
The Security Council, the G5,
Yeah,
but they're
okay,
G7 now
G5.
after the script of
Well,
Russia.
I think the African Union has a better role to play.
But no country in Africa that sits on that council, so how can the foreign countries of Europe and America and wherever discuss this?
No, I think you're right, you're absolutely right.
And also, I am from Rwanda. In 1994, the UN Security Council failed the country because there was nothing for them in the country.
Terrible.
So they let the country say, African savage tribes, they are fighting African savage tribes,
Exactly.
let them massacre themselves.
It's
And
a
then they
targeted
did.
approach.
And 10 years after that, the UN shows up with mental health. Did the people need mental health programs after 10 years of genocide? Or they needed food and bathings and stuff like that?
And you'll note now that Rwanda is leading the African world in many ways, the way they're revolutionizing and changing their focus and the way they're doing things. It could be a model for other people also too. But I think the important question there also too is that how does Africa as a body, and maybe the AU, you know, become more organized in ways to provide the counter narrative to that power within the Security Council? Because the way the Security Council is evoked now, what is the determinant for that power brokering? Nuclear weapons. They all have nuclear weapons. They have nuclear weapons, and that's how they maintain their power. Think about it. That's just one way, and they hold it over the rest of the world. Now it's interesting that South Africa had nuclear weapons, didn't get put into that, or Israel didn't get put into that. But the Big Five, I mean, we got to undo this colonized education in the United States and other places. The issues of education colonialism in Africa needs to be revamped. That's a whole opportunity for rethinking the ways of doing things.
Speaking of nuclear power, Russia is going to build one of the biggest nuclear plants in East Africa, in Rwanda.
I mean, I wouldn't do it.
Okay, but speaking of that,
I wouldn't accept it. You know what I mean? You know.
I don't think that will make Rwanda one of the most great. It would invite Rwanda.
It's who has the most weapons of mass, destruction.
And where did the power that powers those two come from? In over 10 years, 1943, 45, somewhere like that, people from New Mexico might know. The first bomb that was on the Trinity site down in White Sand. The minerals, I forgot that.
Uranium 235 came from Congo.
It's from Congo. They mined almost 6 tons.
Mm-hmm.
6 tons equals what? 6,000 kilograms.
And that place is still a nuclear disaster site.
1,200 tons.
People are exposed to that nuclear radiation still. I know. So it is crazy. You know, Chris Rock once made a joke about that, you know, saying that if everybody had nuclear weapons or nuclear power, maybe it wouldn't be a problem. Or turn all the bullets into nuclear, you know, uranium bullets or something, and it costs too much, so people wouldn't use it because it costs too much, you know. I mean, we can, but this is not the time for jokes and stuff on a level. This is very serious business on so many levels. So it is a question for like how the African Union is going to transform those conversations. You know, when I was in Africa this last trip, I happened to come across a book. It was written by an African American professor at Syracuse, and he broke down all the details about what happened in Libya and America's involvement in that. And I thought like, oh, here's the real stories that we're missing. You know, we got bits and pieces of it. And I thought like, there was another plot to undo Pan-Africanism, you know, and supplying water and gold and challenging the hegemony of the Western powers in many ways, you know.
I think talking about African Union, my little knowledge about African Union operations is that they are preaching unity and empowerment.
Mm-hmm.
And well, one thing that still stands there is how much of resistance are they getting from the Western countries, right? You know, by stopping Africa from, you know, coming together, because Africa realizes that coming together as a nation kind of is one factor that helps Africa to stand.
Go continue on. I had a slide up there with all the resources being taken out of Africa right now.
Okay.
Can you show that again for people?
Yeah, the computer went through.
Oh, it died?
No, I think it's restarted now. So.
Anyway, I have this map showing you where all the Western world right now is going into Africa and extracting all the mineral resources and resources.
I agree with you. Yeah.
And it's sort of like, really?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So,
there is a season 2 of Scrambling for Africa that is about.
It's the second scramble.
Yes, and Africa is aware of this and all that.
Dr. Martin, which isn't this?
Don't worry about it now.
Sure.
It's okay, yeah.
Another point I wanted to make was about, in specific about the United States and other European countries, but I'll speak for United States only. The United States, I worked for AIDS Relief Program, which was a President George Bush's initiative for about 7 years, and it was implemented in Africa, mostly in Sub-Saharan Africa, about HIV. And one thing that I learned from that project 7 years later was the promotion of capitalism. They give you $5 million, and at the end they send expatriates that will use $3 million. Then you're left with $2 million, which you're supposed to operate with. And at the end also, what happens, they send all their tablets from the pharmaceutical companies from the US, and also send equipment from BD and all those big equipment manufacturers, point care, lab equipment. And how is that really helping? And isn't that a new and a modern way of colonizing?
Of course it is. Of course it is. The structural assistance programs, all those things which create more debt and put African countries further indebted is problematic of it also too. Read the book or look at the film Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and what he was doing in terms of Africa and convincing African leaders to pay obeisance to the IMF, the World Bank, and other things, and give them more favorable policies so that that wealth was continually extracted out of Africa and brought elsewhere. We got 1 minute.
I have a question I wanted to ask.
Hang on a second. Let me give the students.
Okay.
You know, because you and I, we share office space practice, so we can always have those discussions. You know. Students, we got 45 seconds left now. Yes, sir.
My question is, how do you suggest a change of balance of power between these corporations that sell these natural resources that they take out of Africa? How do you get the power out of their hands and give it to Africa so that they can sell those natural resources at fair market value?
There's a film right now that I've been using in class that you might want to take a look at. It's in the Fine Arts Library. It's called The Motherland. And they address many of those issues. So get that film and take a look at it, because it goes into those discussions quite well in terms of how certain products are made in Africa for $1, and then they're sold to European countries, and European countries sell it back to them for $20 or so, and other types of things. But nobody's producing anything that other people want to buy. When you first mentioned that comment, it reminded me the example that I always use about these. You know, our predilection and our obsession with faster cell phones and computers and things, and the fact that they would not work as effectively and efficiently if we weren't getting the coltan out of the Congo, amidst all the genocide, the killing, and all the other things that's going on. And at some point, Stanford University, Yale University, and other university students band together, and they passed proclamations, got the university to say that that the university would not purchase computers or any type of equipment where they could not identify where the co-tenant came from. And so a movement like the NIST campus, my students would do some good, because when we look at, I had mentioned the slide and I talked about during the Nixon administration, African Americans and civil rights groups and black power groups and others got together and started putting force on Congress to do X, Y, Z, help break down apartheid in many ways also too. And so we need that type of unity and movement again also too on so many levels. But again, one of the biggest problems is the disconnection from people and how people have become disconnected from Africa. I always tell students that, folks, everybody in this room is African. We have a common ancestor. There's no three races. There are different ethnicities, but there's one race, the human race. We're distant cousins, and we need to start acting like family in many ways. But we got so many myths and so many other lies and stuff that's out there that need to be deconstructed, here and abroad in many ways also too. But if it's going to begin somewhere, again, it's going to begin with you students, asking the most appropriate questions and working with people to bring about that change, you know. Because again, the suffering is just too deep. As I said before, being in hospitals and clinics for a long time and other places, I've seen, I guess, what I call my fair share of death, dying, and suffering. And so I'm obsessed now about trying to work for justice. I'm going to keep doing it until I can't do it anymore. But we got to bring other people along in that process as well. There's more to this discussion, and I'm more than willing to have, you know, for interview. Students know me on campus. If you see me, just say, "Hey, Dr. J, what's up? I want to talk about X, Y, and Z," and I'll stop and we'll talk. And I'll take my email and say, like, "Come meet with me. Let's sit down. Let's talk about this. What are you going to do? How are you going to plan it?" And I'm still open to that also too. You know, as I said before, I remember my classes in international studies and international law as an undergraduate, and I'm a global person. I see one human family, you know, and the sooner we get to that, the better off for everybody. You know? So I think my 1 minute is up, and on that level I've exhausted. So thank you, Dr. Bishop, for you know, last time the three of us worked together, we worked on a malaria project also too in Africa. So thank you folks for giving me a little bit of time to kind of run my mouth and act crazy. But anytime you see me, just stop and let's talk about things, okay? No, that's you folks. That's you folks. Kind of ever.